Today I'm going to show you how to use AppScript triggers to do time-based triggers of functions or event-based triggers. So let's dive right into it. So what we're going to build is the two methods that I just talked about. We're going to start with time-driven, and essentially every so often, periodically, we're going to trigger a function to be called. And what that function will do is it'll put a new row with the time and the price of Bitcoin. So to show you what that looks like, I'm going to click create trigger, and then I'm going to speed this up. Hey, there we go. And we'll check back on that. The second way that we're going to use triggers is event driven. And what I have as an example here is a theoretical content tracker where you want to make sure that each time an update is made, you add a note to indicate what the date and who it was modified by. This is helpful for shared content calendars, and just having a timestamp on when things were done will be a helpful reminder in the future. So this could be really anything in your workflow. So when a cell is updated, I check the box, this note was added, and provides the date and my email address, since that's the account I'm logged into. Let's go back actually and as you can see, the trigger has fired again and added the more up-to-date price of Bitcoin. So I've created a blank spreadsheet with the templates that we are talking about, and as I mentioned, we're gonna do time-driven triggers first. So I'm gonna rename this time-driven, and I'm actually gonna rename the sheet to event-driven. That'll come in handy later, and I'll explain why. As I described, or as we went through, what we want to do is create an app script. And the first step, I'm going to create a function called getPrice. I'm going to create a helper just variable of the spreadsheet app and getActiveSheet. So that assigns sheet to the current spreadsheet we are in. I'm also going to create a last row variable that will give us the index of the last row so that we can add a new row later on. And similarly, last column, get last column. Those are helpful methods that is provided by AppScript. And then I'm also going to, you'll notice here we have a time and a price column. This line is probably going to be very helpful for many of your future projects because I use it all the time. And what it achieves is essentially what column are you trying to update. So I'm going to get range, and you'll see here the get range calls for row and column as inputs. I'm going to select the first row, and what's not shown here is that there's actually 4 potential inputs to get range, but the mandatory ones are row and column. But if you add another comma, number of rows, and I only want the first row. So start from the first row, start from the first column, 1 row in total, and the number of columns I'm going to put last call. And what I'm going to do is get the values in that row. And just to show you what's happening here, I'm going to log it out so you can, and you feel free to do this with me. So I'm going to make sure that getPrice is the function we're triggering. You can Command R or click run. Review permissions. I'm going to allow that. But reminder to title your projects because it can be a little sketchy. So in this result, you'll notice it's an array within an array. So I'm going to want to get the values, and I'm going to want to get the first object in the array, or the first nested array. And I want the index of time, which is this column. Similarly, I'm going to create a price call with everything the same except price. So now I looked around. I was like, Bitcoin price API. I found this Postman link, and it gave me this API call to CoinDesk. So that's what we're going to use in this example. And I actually will rename this to be app script triggers. So now that I have this CoinDesk URL, I'm going to let Bitcoin equal, I'm going to use the URL fetch app.fetch. I'm going to feed in the URL as a string, and I'll just print out what is returned, because this is how I usually work. It's line by line. It's doing a lot of logs. And now that I've added the URL fetch app, it's going to want me to update my authorization. And so the API is successful. It's giving me this JSON object returned. So you can go through that JSON and essentially get to where I got here. So I'm going to parse that, and I'm going to parse the get content text. And I'm also going to let BTC price equal data dot BPI, which was an object within the object, the JSON that was returned. USD, all caps, is how they structure the return, and rate is the price in USD. I'm also going to interpolate this as a string. So the $sign is not a way to format the field as currency, which would make sense in this example, but this is how you inject the data as a string. So now I'm going to take the sheet, I'm going to get range, last row +1. We want to add a new row. Time call +1, because the column indexes that I got up here, they're on the 0 base index, whereas the get range wants the first column is 1 instead of 0. So this equals 0. I'm adding 1 to it to get to the first column. And then I'm going to set value equal to, I'm actually going to create a new time. And how I'm going to do that is utilities.formatDate. And you'll look at the description of how this date should be formatted. You pass in a new date. Time zone, I'm going to do PST because that's my current time zone. I'm on Pacific. And you can see here, like, you could pass in the year, the month, the date, formatted like this. I just want the hours, minutes, and seconds to be returned, because we're trying to show you how this trigger works every minute. So that is the first column. Now I'm going to do the same thing, basically. Price call +1. Set value BTC price, just written like that, because we already interpolated it as a string. Sweet. So that is the get price. And so if I save that, Command S, and run it, it should have returned, and it did, which is great. Now I'm going to set up the trigger that will run that every minute. So function create trigger. You could potentially, I believe, get price to just, when that function is called, it returns a result, so it doesn't look like nothing is happening. But you use the script app class from AppScript, and you add new trigger. And now within this, what is the function name as a string that you want to call? We just wrote it as get price, but it could be whatever you write your function as. And if you were to, I like to tab just to keep things orderly, and you put a period, it tells you, it's like autocomplete, what could potentially be used here. And what we're going to use in this example is time-based. And I'm going to get this a little bit more centered. So time-based, and you'll see here like some of the options, which we can talk more about in a bit. But in this example, I'm going to do every minutes on the minute, and you finish with a create call. So that adds the trigger. I'm also going to create a delete trigger, which you could find within the documentation. But I actually copied and pasted this and it did not work. I don't know why. So I rewrote it just to basically delete all of the triggers, because if you come in here, you have the editor, which is where we currently are. If you look at triggers, this is where your triggers will live. And if you have triggers running, they will continue to run at the cadence that you state. There is some quotas. I think it's like 20 per user. Triggers total runtime 90 minutes a day. So I guess it would run, if you are doing 1 minute intervals, it would only run 90 times before breaking for that day. If you love the triggers, like, you basically can only use 20 of them in your current account, even at the paid level, which is pretty wild. So Google does not like automation as much as I do, apparently. So back to this trigger, I'm going to create it. Actually, that would be, so I'm going to create trigger, and I'll add the delete in a second so we can get this going to show that it works. So I'm going to go back over here, and the trigger was added. Awesome. So now I'm going to create the get or the delete trigger function. I'm going to const triggers equals script app dot get project triggers, and I'm going to create a for loop. Let I, which is short for index, equals 0. I is less than triggers dot length, I plus plus, and script app dot delete trigger triggers I. Yeah, that's a very basic way to just delete all triggers. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to come back to the sheet and see how we've progressed. So once I added this new trigger, it added, at each minute, as you just see right now, adds a new line with the updated price. That's fantastic. That's exactly what we wanted. And now I'm going to delete the trigger. So I'm going to run that. I'm going to come back over to triggers, and now that's gone. Awesome. That works. So now we'll move on to event-driven triggers. And the most basic one that we're going to use in most projects that are using AppScript is the onOpen. So that's actually an event-driven trigger, because when the sheet is open, this triggers. So I'm going to create a new function called testing on open. And I'm going to get the UI. And basically UI, I'm going to show an alert that this function was called on open. Sweet. I'm going to refresh, which is going to close out the app script file. But as you can see, that function was called. There's another onEdit, which is similar to onOpen. So let's just quickly go to the docs. Simple triggers, and I will include links to these in the description below. And I'm only going to show you onOpen and onEdit because these are the most commonly used, in my opinion. The other ones, like onInstall, apparently when a user adds an add-on, I guess that could be helpful if you create an add-on and you want to provide some background instructions for getting up to speed. And the onEdit is really helpful for when a user changes a value in spreadsheet. So let me go to the event-driven tab and remind you that we're going to display when an update was made to this content tracker example and by who. So back in here, I'm going to create the onEdit, which takes an optional event. So as you know, or as you saw earlier in my onOpen, I didn't pass the event through, but in this example, I'm going to get the range that the user is active in. What is the event fired on? And I'm going to update the range with a note. So update the cell, basically. So this could be called cell. Although if a user updates many at one time, it would be a range. So I'm just going to keep it as that. Last modified on space, and I'm going to add a utilities again. I'm going to format the date, new date, and in this, I guess I could do PST again, month, day, and the full year to understand who updated on what date. The time really doesn't matter in this example. And I'm going to add by session, which is another helpful function that is exposed in AppScript. Get active user, and I'm going to get their email address. So now, if someone were to fire this, they update this tab, or update this cell, I should say, you'll notice it was last modified on the 1st by me. The issue with that, how I just wrote it, is that if you were to come back over here and make an update, it would add that same note. And I don't want that. I only want it to live in this event-driven tab. So I'm just going to quickly add if statement. If spreadsheet app dot get active sheet dot get sheet name is equal to 3 equal signs event driven, which is what I renamed the sheet. I'm going to move all of this code to be conditional upon that. And now when I go back to this tab, because I have event driven, you'll see that a note was added here. A note was added here. But if I go here, no note is added. And that is the goal. So hopefully this was a helpful introduction to setting up triggers. There are many more versions of triggers that you could set here, and playing around with this by going to the time base, adding a period, and looking at some of the available methods is really helpful. Because as an example, I set up a trigger a certain day of the month. So on month day, like as on the 15th of every month or on the 1st of every month, you can run that at hour 9 a.m., for example. And then you would, of course, remove every minute. So I like to set it up to run every minute so that I can see that the trigger is firing and everything is working. But then I could save this and it would run a trigger to get the price of Bitcoin on the 1st of the month every month. As an example, it would call that API. Thank you so much for the time. If you made it this far, I hope that this was helpful. If you have any requests or run into any issues, feel free to comment